Good morning, everybody. There are passages in Scripture that carry an intensity of the solemnity that sometimes you just have to sit back and let it hit you. Not that all of Scripture is not solemn, but some passages carry an intensity than others. And today's gospel reading is one of those passages. The solemnity with which the scroll is handed to Jesus, giving the detail that Jesus unrolled the scroll and he found the passage from Isaiah. The eyes of all in the synagogue looking intently at him after he had finished reading. And Jesus announcing at the end of that passage, "Today the scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing," all point to a solemn, momentous, historic event. And yes, that was an event, especially the words from Isaiah ending with the words, "To proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord," had a very specific meaning. What does it mean? The themes in the passage that Jesus read from Isaiah give us a clue. The themes such as bring glad tidings to the poor, proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free is a reference to the Jubilee. And so when Jesus says at the end of that passage, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing," was Jesus declaring a Jubilee year. As you already know, Pope Francis has declared 2025 a Jubilee year. And I would like to reflect with you more deeply on the concept of the Jubilee and its implications for the world, for the church, for ourselves. For those of you who might be unfamiliar, how is the Jubilee year calculated? What is the history behind this? To understand the Jubilee, we must begin with the Sabbath and the Sabbath year. For the Hebrew people, just as every seventh day is Sabbath, a day sacred to the Lord, every seventh year was observed as a Sabbath year. Leviticus 25, 2-7 talks about the Sabbath year. And it's called the Sabbath year for the land. And land here can have multiple meanings. The land itself, but then also the people and the creatures who dwell in the land. During the Sabbath, people did not plant. Sabbath year, people did not plant, prune, or harvest. People could eat whatever the land produced on its own, the remaining seeds or whatever grew, people would eat that. The slaves, the tenants, the livestock, and the wild animals could eat freely of whatever the land produced. So nobody gathered the produce just for themselves. It was everybody's, including slaves and tenants and wild animals. After 7 such Sabbath years, 7 times 7 is 49, the 50th year was to be declared as a Jubilee year. Leviticus 25, 8 to 22 states that the Jubilee year was to be proclaimed by blowing a ram's horn on the Day of Atonement. And so really speaking, 2025 as a Jubilee year was proclaimed by Pope Francis last year. It prescribed, "You shall proclaim liberty in the land of all its inhabitants." You see what Christ was preaching? I have come to proclaim liberty to the captives. It comes straight from this Jubilee theme. "It shall be a Jubilee for you when each of you will return to your own property." And this has implications. Each of you to your own family, that has implications. "The 50th year is your year of Jubilee. You shall not sow, nor shall you reap the aftergrowth, or pick the untrimmed vines, since it is the Jubilee. It shall be sacred for you. You may only eat what the field yields for itself." So that's how the Jubilee is calculated. What's the purpose of the Sabbath and the Jubilee years? And this is my second point. The purpose of the Sabbath was to restore the relationship between God and humanity, between humans and other people around them, and humans and the earth, the land. Giving the land some rest every 7th year made the earth more fertile and sustainable. Just as the Sabbath day was set aside for God, the Sabbath year gave God honor and became an expression of gratitude for all that God provides. Now, the Jubilee year has some of these themes, but on a much grander scale. The Jubilee was a time when the Israelites would return to their original land. And so what happened was, if somebody had to sell a piece of the land because they were in debt, Jubilee year, people went back to their original land. Debts were forgiven, and slaves were freed. The Jubilee year was a time to learn mercy by giving mercy. The Jubilee year was a time to create social and economic parity. It was a time for economic, cultural, environmental, and communal reset. And this word reset, it's a very important term, that you begin all again. So it is stunning to me, it truly is stunning to me, that a primitive people had more awareness of the connection between land and people than we do today. We who are the products of the industrial and technological age, we live so much unaware of the connection between the land. I mean, you go to Myers, there are no seasonal products. You get everything whenever you want. We have lost that connection between the land and how we consume, right? But those people, they had an awareness of that. They also had a deeper awareness of the need for social equality than we do. Imagine everybody getting a chance at a new beginning. How many of you have credit card debts? And imagine every so often they had to say to us, everybody, it's all forgiven. And you get a new beginning, right? How many families in the United States are one sickness away from bankruptcy? This is the reality of our situation. And here are a people who gave everybody a new chance. If you're a slave, set free. Debts forgiven. Everybody goes back to their own land. So imagine making the connection between land and the people for sustainable growth. Imagine creating structures, not just act of charity, but imagine creating structures that ensure forgiveness, justice, and mercy. The Jubilee was a celebration of mercy, of hope, of social equality, and care for creation. All of this 3,000 years ago. More than 3,000 years ago. That brings us to Jubilee 2025. The Catholic celebration of the Jubilee goes back to Pope Boniface VIII in 1300. So the origin of the Jubilee lies in the book of Leviticus. But then Catholics, of course, we're a Judeo-Christian tradition, then continued to live this Jubilee, and it began once again in 1300. Initially, the Jubilee was celebrated every 100 years, and then 50, and now it is celebrated every 25 years. Although, just a few years back, I want to say about 10 years back, Pope Francis had declared a Jubilee of Mercy. That was a different kind of a Jubilee, but this is like the Jubilee for the entire land. Now, the theme for Jubilee 2025 is Pilgrims of Hope. The document declaring the Jubilee is titled Spes non confundit, or in English, Hope does not disappoint. And as serious Catholics, I'm inviting you at some point to do a search and trace this article down. It's a lengthy article, but it's worth reading what the Pope is calling for in this Jubilee. I'm going to give you a brief summary, but it's a very, very, very powerful document. So, the Pope makes a widespread appeal for hope. First of all, he appeals for diplomacy, for negotiations and peace instead of easily resorting to war. And how easily we go to war. Sometimes we go to war because we want employment not to be lost in the arms industry. It's a business now. It's not about bringing justice and peace. He appeals for diplomacy and negotiations. He appeals for a greater appreciation for life and openness to life. He appeals for greater sensitivity to those enduring hardships, prisoners, the sick, and those with disabilities. He appeals for a greater attention to the frustrations of adolescents and youth. About the migrants and refugees who are often treated disparagingly in our own nation and around the globe, Pope Francis says, their expectation must not be frustrated by prejudice and rejection. He appeals for hope for the elderly and grandparents whose wisdom can enlighten the world. And then there are millions of poor in the world. And I love the statement from Pope Francis. I'm going to read it to you. It is scandalous, he says, that in a world possessed of immense resources, destined largely to producing weapons, the poor continue to be the majority of the planet's population, billions of people. I mean, look how screwed up our priorities are. Keeping with the themes of the original Jubilee and the themes contained in today's gospel, he calls for a just distribution of wealth among people. Do you know in our country, 3 people, no need to mention names, 3 people hold more than $1 trillion. 3 people. He says, I renew my appeal that with the money spent on weapons and other military expenditures, let us establish a global fund that can finally put an end to hunger and favor development in the most impoverished countries so that their citizens will not resort to violent or illusory situations or to have to leave their countries in order to seek a more dignified life. He further calls for a forgiveness of debt of the impoverished countries by affluent nations. And finally, there is a special appeal for the ecological debt, how we live on this earth. That exists in a way, he says, that the world's resources are exploited. Towards the end, he kind of has this statement, which I love deeply. If we really wish to prepare a path to peace in our world, let us commit ourselves to remedying the remote causes of injustice, settling unjust and unpayable debts, and feeding the hungry. Now, if you do read this document, or if you've heard this today, you might say, the ideals of this document are so beyond my power. What do I do with forgiving debts of nations? Or what can I do to make sure that the climate, the environment and the earth are treated with respect? But, we could all take personal and small steps in a local way. Now, think about this. When the next Jubilee is celebrated, I will be 83 years old. And there are many of you here, this is your last Jubilee. And for many people, this is your first Jubilee. It's time to take this, I believe, very seriously. So I'm appealing to families, that I see so many young families, or there are couples, or they're just your individual people with a larger family. I'm asking you to declare your own Jubilee. Let there be a Jubilee in your house and make everybody aware of what is it that we can do to live this year meaningfully and fruitfully. Let's make an effort in our families and as a parish community to implement the implications of the Jubilee in small and local ways. For example, we may not have the power to forgive debts of nations, but is there someone in our lives we can set free by our forgiveness? That's in our power, right? We can care more for the poor, the sick, those in prison, the elderly, and those with disabilities. We can treat migrants and refugees with the dignity they deserve. We can have greater appreciation for the migrants and refugees and seek peace instead of confrontation. We can all care more for the earth and live more simply and lessen the impact on the environment. We can all do this. This is within our power. We can make Jubilee 2025 an exercise in hope. We can all, like Jesus, proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. Jubilee 2025. Let us be pilgrims of hope. The hope promised by the ancient Jubilee, the hope that was proclaimed by Jesus Christ as he declared his Jubilee, and the hope to which Pope Francis appeals for this Jubilee in 2025 in our own times. People of God said,